In 1993, a French philosopher sat down and wrote something extraordinary. He described a future where human beings would sit motionless before their computers, conducting their relationships through screens, outsourcing their thinking to machines, and surrendering their freedom not to dictators or armies, but to devices they would carry willingly in their pockets. He warned that intelligent machines would become mental prostheses for a species that had lost the desire to think for itself. He said that we would not be enslaved by technology in any dramatic or cinematic way. Instead, we would simply hand over our humanity piece by piece in exchange for convenience. And then he watched as the world ignored him almost entirely. His name was Jean Baudrillard, and 30 years before ChatGPT, 3 decades before AI companions and deepfakes and algorithmically curated realities, this man described the world you and I are living in tonight with an accuracy that borders on the unsettling. He is the philosopher who inspired The Matrix, the thinker who declared that a war watched by millions never actually happened, and the prophet who saw your smartphone before the engineers at Apple had even dreamed of it. Most people have never heard his name. Those who have often dismiss him as too strange, too pessimistic, too French. But tonight, as you settle into rest, I want to take you through his life, his ideas, and his warnings. Because the closer you look at what Baudrillard wrote in the final decades of the 20th century, the more it feels less like philosophy and more like a letter addressed to you personally, from someone who somehow knew exactly what your life would look like. This is the story of the man who watched reality disappear and tried to tell us it was happening. Jean Baudrillard was born on the 27th of July, 1929, in the cathedral city of Reims, in northeastern France. If you have ever seen photographs of Reims, you know it as a place of old stone and quiet grandeur, famous for its Gothic cathedral where French kings were once crowned. But the Reims that Baudrillard was born into was not the city of postcards and tourism. It was a place still scarred by the First World War, still rebuilding, still carrying the weight of a history that had torn through its streets within living memory. And into this landscape of reconstruction and memory, a child was born to a family that had no connection whatsoever to the world of ideas. His grandparents were peasant farmers. His parents had climbed one small rung on the social ladder to become civil servants, but they remained firmly rooted in the provincial working class. There were no bookshelves lined with philosophy in the Baudrillard household, no dinner table debates about Hegel or Kant. The world of the French intellectual elite, the salons and universities and publishing houses of Paris, might as well have existed on another planet. And yet, this boy from Reims would become the first member of his family to attend university, a decision that he later said created a rupture with his parents and his entire cultural world. That rupture, that sense of being permanently displaced, of belonging fully to neither the world he came from nor the world he entered, would shape everything he wrote for the rest of his life. Because Baudrillard never lost the outsider's eye. He never quite believed in the systems and structures that the insiders took for granted. And it was precisely this distance, this refusal to fully belong, that allowed him to see what others could not. During his years at the Lycée in Reims, something happened that would quietly redirect the course of his thinking. He encountered a philosophy professor named Emmanuel Paley, who introduced him to pataphysics. Now, if you have never heard of pataphysics, you are in good company because it is one of the strangest intellectual movements in European history. Invented by the French writer Alfred Jarry in the late 19th century, pataphysics is essentially a parody of science. It presents itself as the science of imaginary solutions, a discipline that studies the laws governing exceptions and offers absurd answers to serious questions. On the surface, it sounds like a joke. And in many ways, it was. But underneath the humor lay something deeply serious, a suspicion that the systems we use to explain reality might themselves be fictions, that our models of the world might have more in common with fantasy than with truth. Baudrillard was fascinated, and scholars who study his work have noted that this early encounter with pataphysics left a permanent mark on his thinking. Throughout his career, there would always be something playful and deliberately provocative about his ideas, a willingness to push arguments to their most extreme and uncomfortable conclusions, not because he wanted to be difficult, but because he believed that only by stretching ideas to their breaking point could you see what they were really made of. When Baudrillard moved to Paris to attend the Sorbonne, he did not study philosophy or sociology. He studied German language and literature. For years, beginning in the late 1950s and continuing through the mid-1960s, he worked as a German teacher at various high schools in and around Paris, translating the works of writers like Bertolt Brecht and Peter Weiss, and reviewing literary works for French publishers. He also translated works by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, immersing himself in the revolutionary tradition even as he lived the unremarkable daily routine of a provincial schoolteacher. It was quiet, unglamorous work, and it gave no hint of the intellectual revolution that was brewing beneath the surface. But those years of translation were not wasted. Working closely with German texts meant working closely with German thought. And through his translations, Baudrillard absorbed the ideas of Marx, Nietzsche, and Weber, thinkers whose influence would pulse through everything he later wrote. There is something fitting about the fact that Baudrillard came to philosophy through language rather than through the traditional academic pipeline. Translators develop a particular sensitivity to the gap between words and meaning, between what a text says on the surface and what it communicates beneath. They learn that meaning is never simply transferred from one language to another, but must be reconstructed, reimagined, and sometimes invented in the passage between tongues. This awareness of the instability of meaning, the way it shifts and slides and never quite settles into a fixed relationship with the world, would become one of the central themes of Baudrillard's entire career. He was also, during these years, deeply influenced by the political upheavals of the era. The French occupation of Algeria and the brutal war for independence that followed through the 1950s and into the early 1960s weighed heavily on the French left. Baudrillard opposed the colonial project, and this early engagement with anti-colonial politics gave him a visceral understanding of how power operates through representation, how an occupying force creates an image of the people it dominates that serves to justify the domination itself. Colonies, he would later realize, were among the first laboratories of simulation, places where reality was systematically replaced by a narrative that served the interests of the powerful. Baudrillard married twice over the course of his life and had 2 children from his first marriage. But he was always a private man when it came to personal details, and his autobiographical comments were sparse and carefully controlled. What mattered to him was not the biography of the individual, but the biography of ideas, the way concepts were born, transformed, and consumed in the cultural marketplace, just as objects were born, transformed, and consumed in the economic one. The transformation of Baudrillard from a schoolteacher to a thinker of global significance, when he transferred from literature to sociology and began working under the supervision of Henri Lefebvre at the University of Paris, Nanterre. Lefebvre was himself a fascinating figure, a Marxist philosopher who had pioneered the critique of everyday life, arguing that capitalism did not only exploit workers in factories, but shaped the most intimate details of how people lived, consumed, and understood themselves. Under Lefebvre's guidance, Baudrillard began to develop his own approach to understanding modern society, one that would eventually take him far beyond anything his mentor had imagined. But it was not only Lefebvre who shaped Baudrillard at Nanterre. The university itself was a crucible of radical politics. In May 1968, France erupted in a wave of student protests and worker strikes that brought the country to a standstill. The uprising began at Nanterre, in the very sociology department where Baudrillard worked, led by a fiery student named Daniel Cohn-Bendit and a group known as the Enragers, the Enraged Ones. Students occupied buildings, confronted police, built barricades in the streets of Paris, and for a few extraordinary weeks, it seemed as though the entire social order might collapse. Workers joined the students, factories were occupied, and for a brief electric moment, the structures of power seemed to tremble. Baudrillard was there, watching, participating on the margins, absorbing the energy and the disillusionment that followed when the revolution failed to materialize. Because it did fail. The government of Charles de Gaulle weathered the storm, elections were held, normalcy returned, and the consumer economy, far from being overthrown, simply absorbed the revolutionary energy and turned it into a marketing opportunity. The slogans of 1968 were printed on T-shirts. The imagery of rebellion was used to sell products. The system had demonstrated something profoundly disturbing. It could metabolize its own opposition, swallow dissent whole, and convert it into just another commodity to be bought and sold. This experience left Baudrillard deeply skeptical of traditional political solutions. If even the most passionate and organized resistance could be absorbed and neutralized by the system it opposed, then perhaps the problem was not political at all. Perhaps the problem was deeper, woven into the very fabric of how modern societies create and consume meaning. During this period, Baudrillard also associated himself with the journal Utopie, a group of intellectuals on the margins of architecture, city planning, and social theory who sought to combine reflections on alternative societies with critiques of everyday life. Inspired partly by Guy Debord and the Situationist International, who had argued that modern capitalism operated through spectacle, the Utopie group pushed Baudrillard further toward the margins of conventional academic thinking. His affiliation with this group was brief, lasting only into the early 1970s, but it reinforced his instinct to work outside established intellectual categories and to develop his own path regardless of where it led. Baudrillard was part of a remarkable generation of French thinkers whose ideas would reshape intellectual life around the world. Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Gilles Deleuze, Jean-François Lyotard. Each of these contemporaries was developing their own radical critique of modern society and modern thought, but Baudrillard always stood somewhat apart from this group. And not only because his academic training was in German literature rather than philosophy, his approach was more provocative, more aphoristic, more willing to sacrifice scholarly precision for the sake of a striking insight. Where Foucault meticulously documented the structures of power and knowledge, Baudrillard painted in bold, sweeping strokes. Where Derrida carefully deconstructed the logic of Western metaphysics, Baudrillard simply declared the whole edifice a simulation and moved on. This made him both more accessible and more easily dismissed than his peers, a combination that would define his reputation for the rest of his career. And it was this question, this nagging suspicion, that reality itself was being restructured in ways that traditional political analysis could not capture, that launched Baudrillard on the intellectual journey that would consume the rest of his life. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Baudrillard published a series of books that began to outline a radical new way of understanding modern society. His first major work, The System of Objects, appeared in 1968, the same year the streets of Paris were burning. It was followed by The Consumer Society in 1970, and For a Critique of the Political Economy of the Sign in 1972. These books were dense, challenging, and deeply original, and they announced the arrival of a thinker who was willing to tear apart the assumptions that everyone else took for granted. The central insight of these early works was deceptively simple but profoundly unsettling. Karl Marx had argued that the engine of modern society was production. Workers produced goods, capitalists extracted profit, and the struggle between these two classes drove history forward. Baudrillard said Marx had it backward. Or rather, Marx had described an earlier phase of capitalism that was rapidly being replaced by something new. In the modern world, Baudrillard argued, it was not production but consumption that held society together. We were no longer defined primarily by what we made, but by what we bought. And what we bought, Baudrillard insisted, was not really the things themselves. When you purchase a luxury handbag, you are not buying leather and stitching. You are buying the sign of status, taste, and belonging that the bag communicates to everyone who sees it. When you choose one brand of coffee over another, you are not simply selecting a beverage. You are participating in a system of meaning where your choice signals something about who you are and where you fit in the social hierarchy. Baudrillard called this sign value. and he argued that it had become more important than either the practical usefulness of objects or their economic cost. This was a genuinely revolutionary idea. It meant that the entire consumer economy was not really about satisfying human needs at all. It was about producing and circulating signs, symbols, and meanings that people consumed in order to construct their identities. Advertising did not simply inform you about products. It created desires you never knew you had by attaching powerful symbolic meanings to ordinary objects. Fashion did not merely keep you clothed. It enrolled you in a constantly shifting system of social signaling where falling behind meant falling out. And the most insidious part of this system was that it felt entirely natural. People did not experience themselves as manipulated. They experienced themselves as making free choices that expressed their authentic selves. The system worked precisely because it was invisible. Baudrillard was particularly insightful about how this system of signs operated through what he called the ideological genesis of needs. Traditional economics assumed that human beings have genuine, pre-existing needs that the economy exists to satisfy. You need food, so farmers grow crops. You need shelter, so builders construct houses. The economy responds to demand. But Baudrillard argued that in the modern consumer society, the process is reversed. The economy does not respond to needs. It creates them. Through advertising, through the constant introduction of new products, through the social pressure to keep up with trends and fashions, the consumer economy manufactures the very desires it then claims to satisfy. You did not know you needed a smartphone until someone convinced you that you did. You did not know you needed a particular brand of sneakers until the sign value attached to that brand was lodged in your consciousness by 1,000 advertisements. The need came after the product, not before it. And this meant that the consumer was not the sovereign individual that free market economics described, but a creature whose desires were shaped, managed, and directed by the very system that profited from fulfilling them. Credit, Baudrillard noted, was the mechanism that made this entire system possible. By allowing people to consume now and pay later, credit removed the last natural constraint on desire. You no longer needed to earn the money before you could buy the sign. The future was mortgaged to the present, and the present was mortgaged to desire, and desire was mortgaged to a system of signs that existed for no purpose other than its own perpetuation. If you are listening to this tonight and thinking that this sounds eerily familiar, you are beginning to see why Baudrillard matters. Think about the world of social media, of influencer culture, of carefully curated online identities, where every purchase, every meal, every vacation is selected not for its intrinsic value, but for the signal it sends to an audience of followers and friends. Baudrillard described this world in the early 1970s, decades before Instagram existed, decades before the word influencer entered the language. He saw the logic of sign value and understood that it would only accelerate, that the gap between what things are and what they mean would continue to widen until meaning itself became the primary commodity. But Baudrillard was not content to simply modify Marx's framework. By the mid-1970s, he had concluded that Marx's entire system of thought was itself a kind of simulation, a model that had become so embedded in intellectual culture that people mistook it for an accurate description of reality. In The Mirror of Production, published in 1973, Baudrillard argued that Marxism did not challenge capitalism at its deepest level, but actually reinforced some of its most fundamental assumptions. Both Marx and Adam Smith, Baudrillard pointed out, took for granted the idea that human beings have genuine needs and that the purpose of economic activity is to satisfy those needs. But what if needs themselves are manufactured? What if the distinction between real needs and artificial desires, between what we genuinely require and what we have been persuaded to want, is itself part of the illusion? This was a radical break, and it cost Baudrillard dearly within the French intellectual left. To reject Marx in 1970s Paris was to reject the gravitational center of progressive thought. It was to cast yourself adrift from the community that had sustained and validated your work. But Baudrillard followed the logic of his argument wherever it led, even when it led to intellectual isolation. And what he found on the other side of that break was the territory that would make him famous, the vast uncharted landscape of simulation, hyperreality, and the slow disappearance of the real. He also began to draw on thinkers outside the Marxist tradition. The anthropologist Marcel Mauss, who had studied gift exchange in traditional societies, gave Baudrillard a model of human interaction that was fundamentally different from the economic exchanges of capitalism. In gift societies, Mauss had observed objects are not exchanged for profit, but as expressions of social bonds. A gift carries something of the giver with it, creating an obligation and a connection that cannot be reduced to monetary value. Baudrillard called this symbolic exchange, and he saw in it a form of genuine human connection that the consumer economy had systematically destroyed and replaced with commodified imitations. This distinction between symbolic exchange and sign value would become one of the most important threads running through all of Baudrillard's later work, and it would prove especially relevant when he turned his attention to what AI was doing to human relationships. Georges Bataille, another key influence, had written about excess, waste, and expenditure as fundamental features of human societies. Where economists saw waste as inefficiency, Bataille saw it as a necessary expression of human vitality, the overflow of energy that cannot be contained within rational systems of production and consumption. Baudrillard absorbed this insight and wove it into his growing critique of a civilization that was becoming ever more efficient, ever more rational, and ever more sterile. By the end of the 1970s, Baudrillard had assembled the intellectual tools he needed for his most ambitious project. He had a theory of consumption that went far beyond economics. He had a concept of sign value that explained how meaning could be manufactured and circulated like any other commodity. He had an understanding of symbolic exchange that revealed what was being lost in the transition to a fully commodified world. And he had a growing conviction that something fundamental was changing in the relationship between human beings and reality itself. The question was no longer whether capitalism exploited workers. The question was whether reality, the shared ground on which all human interaction depends, was being systematically replaced by something else entirely. But these early works were only the foundation. The structure Baudrillard would build upon them was far stranger, far more ambitious, and far more disturbing than anyone could have predicted. In 1981, Baudrillard published the book that would define his legacy and change the way an entire generation thought about reality. It was called Simulacra and Simulation. And if you have ever watched The Matrix, you have already been introduced to its central ideas, whether you realized it or not. The book represented a decisive break from Baudrillard's earlier, more sociological work, where his previous books had analyzed consumer society within a recognizable academic framework. Simulacra and Simulation launched into territory that was genuinely unprecedented. It was part philosophy, part cultural criticism, part poetic meditation on the strange condition of living in a world where the real was being steadily evacuated and replaced by its own image. The writing style itself had changed. Gone was the careful academic argumentation of his early works. In its place was something more aphoristic, more provocative, more deliberately unsettling. Baudrillard was no longer simply analyzing modern culture. He was performing it, demonstrating through the very texture of his prose the kind of reality collapse he was describing. The book opens with a reference to a short story by the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges, in which the cartographers of a vast empire create a map so incredibly detailed that it eventually covers the entire territory it was meant to represent. In the story, when the empire declines, the map slowly deteriorates, its edges fraying in the desert wind, until all that remains are scattered fragments lying across the landscape. Baudrillard took this image and turned it inside out. In our world, he argued, the process has been reversed. The map has not deteriorated. The territory has. The representations we create of reality, our images, our media, our digital constructions, have become so pervasive and so convincing that they have replaced the reality they were supposed to describe. We no longer live in the territory. We live in the map, and the map has taken on a life of its own. To explain how this happened, Baudrillard traced 4 stages in the evolution of images and their relationship to reality. In the first stage, an image is a faithful reflection of reality. Think of a photograph taken before the age of digital editing, an honest attempt to capture the world as it actually appears. The image refers to something real, and we trust it because we can verify its accuracy by comparing it to the world around us. In the second stage, the image begins to distort reality. It still refers to something real, but it manipulates and reshapes that reality for its own purposes. Think of the carefully lit and retouched photographs that fill fashion magazines. Images that claim to show you a real person, but have been so heavily altered that they bear only a passing resemblance to any actual human being. The image is still connected to reality, but the connection has become dishonest. In the third stage, something far more troubling happens. The image no longer distorts reality, because there is no longer any reality to distort. The image masks the absence of reality. It pretends to refer to something real, but behind the surface, there is nothing. Baudrillard used the example of Disneyland to illustrate this point, and it remains one of his most brilliant and unsettling observations. Disneyland, he argued, exists to make us believe that the rest of America is real. By creating an obviously artificial fantasy world, complete with animatronic pirates and plastic castles, and perpetually smiling employees in costume, Disneyland implies that everything outside its gates is authentic and genuine. The logic is subtle but powerful. If Disneyland is the fantasy, then everything else must be reality. But Baudrillard's provocation was that this is itself an illusion. The world outside Disneyland is no more real than the world inside it. Both are constructed, managed, and simulated experiences. American suburbs with their identical houses and manicured lawns, shopping malls with their climate-controlled interiors and perpetual background music. Even the natural landscapes of national parks that are carefully maintained and manage to conform to an image of wilderness that tourists expect to find. All of these are simulations, environments constructed to produce specific experiences and emotions. Disneyland simply has the honesty to announce itself as fiction. The rest of the world hides its fictional nature behind the pretense of authenticity. This argument extends naturally to the digital spaces we inhabit today. Think of the metaverse that technology companies have been trying to build. Virtual worlds where people can work, socialize, and shop through digital avatars. These projects are often presented as futuristic departures from reality. But from Baudrillard's perspective, they are simply making explicit what has already been true for decades. We already live in simulated environments. We already interact through curated representations of ourselves. We already consume experiences that have been designed and optimized for our engagement. The metaverse is not a departure from reality. It is the logical extension of a process that has been underway since the first shopping mall was built and the first television commercial aired. And then comes the fourth stage, the stage that Baudrillard believed we had already entered. In this final phase, the image has no relationship to reality whatsoever. It is pure simulation, a copy without an original, a sign that refers only to other signs. At this point, the distinction between real and simulated has collapsed entirely. We live in what Baudrillard called hyperreality, a condition in which simulations are not less real than reality, but are experienced as more real, more vivid, more compelling than the increasingly pale and inaccessible world they have replaced. Consider how this plays out in your own life. When you scroll through a social media feed, you encounter a cascade of images, stories, opinions, and experiences that have been algorithmically selected and arranged to maximize your engagement. None of it is accidental. None of it is neutral. The feed does not show you the world. It shows you a simulation of the world, optimized to keep you scrolling. And over time, this simulated world becomes more familiar, more emotionally resonant, and more compelling than the unfiltered world outside your screen. You develop opinions about events you have never witnessed, form attachments to people you have never met, and experience emotions triggered by situations that exist only as pixels on a display. This is hyperreality. This is what Baudrillard described in 1981, more than a decade before the World Wide Web went public. Think about how deeply this has penetrated even the most personal domains of experience. When a couple goes on vacation, the experience is increasingly shaped not by the place itself, but by the images they have already seen of that place on Instagram or travel blogs. They arrive at a famous viewpoint, and their first instinct is not to look at the landscape, but to photograph it, to compare their photograph to the ones they have already consumed, to share it so that others can consume their experience in turn. The simulation of the vacation, the curated images and captions and hashtags becomes more vivid and more enduring than the vacation itself. Months later, what they remember is not the smell of salt air or the warmth of the sun, but the photos in their camera roll, the mediated version of an experience that was never fully experienced in the first place. Or consider how news is consumed in the age of hyperreality. An event occurs somewhere in the world. Within minutes, it is processed into images, headlines, tweets, and video clips. These representations are then algorithmically distributed to billions of screens, where they are consumed, commented on, remixed, and redistributed. By the time most people encounter the event, it has already been transformed into a media product, stripped of its context, amplified in some dimensions, and muted in others, shaped by the imperatives of engagement rather than the demands of truth. And people respond not to the event, but to the representation of the event, forming opinions and making decisions based on a simulation that may bear only a passing resemblance to what actually occurred. Baudrillard would not have been surprised by the era of viral misinformation or the post-truth phenomenon. He would have said that these are not aberrations, but the natural consequences of a world that lost its grip on reality decades ago. The implications were staggering. If we can no longer distinguish between what is real and what is simulated, then all the categories we use to navigate the world begin to break down. Truth and falsehood, authenticity and artifice, experience and representation, all of these distinctions depend on there being a stable reality against which they can be measured. Remove that reality, or replace it with a simulation so convincing that the difference becomes undetectable, and you have entered a world where certainty itself becomes impossible. Not because truth does not exist, but because we have lost the tools to find it. Baudrillard described this condition with a phrase that would later become famous, far beyond the world of academic philosophy. He called it the desert of the real, and it is a phrase that captures something profound about the loneliness of living in a world where surfaces have devoured everything beneath them. The connection between Baudrillard's ideas and one of the most successful science fiction films ever made is one of those rare moments when academic philosophy crashes headlong into popular culture and neither is quite the same afterward. When the Wachowskis were developing The Matrix in the late 1990s, they required every member of the cast to read Simulacra and Simulation before filming began. The book appears in the film itself. Early in the story, the character of Neo opens a hollowed-out copy of Baudrillard's book, using it to conceal contraband software. It was not a subtle reference. The Wachowskis wanted their audience to know that this film was built on a philosophical foundation, and that foundation was Baudrillard. The film's central premise, that humanity lives unknowingly inside a computer-generated simulation while their real bodies lie in pods, their energy harvested by machines, translates Baudrillard's ideas about hyperreality into a dramatic narrative. The famous scene in which Morpheus offers Neo a choice between a blue pill, which would return him to comfortable ignorance, and a red pill, which would reveal the terrible truth, has become one of the most widely recognized metaphors in modern culture. And when Morpheus welcomes Neo to the desert of the real, he is quoting Baudrillard directly. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Baudrillard himself was not impressed. When asked about The Matrix, he expressed disappointment. The film, he argued, had fundamentally misunderstood his ideas. The Matrix presents a world in which there is a clear distinction between the real world and the simulated world, and the hero's journey involves waking up from the simulation and seeing reality as it truly is. But Baudrillard's entire point was that this distinction no longer exists. There is no red pill. There is no moment of awakening. There is no hidden reality waiting to be revealed behind the curtain of appearances. The simulation is not a veil covering reality. The simulation is all there is, and this is why Baudrillard's vision is in many ways far more disturbing than anything the Matrix portrays. In the film, the problem has a solution. In Baudrillard's philosophy, the problem is the condition itself, and there is no outside from which to view it objectively. The fact that even the filmmakers who tried hardest to bring Baudrillard's ideas to life ended up softening them tells you something important about how uncomfortable those ideas really are. We want to believe there is a real world underneath the simulations. We want to believe that authenticity is possible, that truth can be separated from fiction, that if we just look hard enough, we can find solid ground. Baudrillard's radical suggestion was that this desire for solid ground might itself be the final and most powerful simulation of all. The irony was not lost on Baudrillard, a man who had spent his career arguing that reality was being replaced by its representations, found his own ideas being consumed, simplified, and turned into entertainment by the very media culture he had diagnosed. The thinker became a simulation of himself. The critic of spectacle became part of the spectacle. And somewhere in the gap between what Baudrillard actually wrote and what popular culture made of his writing, some of his most important warnings got lost. In the years after The Matrix, Baudrillard continued to develop his ideas in directions that received less popular attention, but were, in many ways, more profound. He retired from the University of Paris at Nanterre in 1987, but continued to write and lecture prolifically. He made a celebrated lecture tour of the United States, speaking at Columbia University, the Art Institute of Chicago, and other institutions, and found that his ideas had a particularly enthusiastic reception among American audiences. There was something about the American landscape, with its shopping malls and theme parks and endless suburbs, that seemed to confirm his theories more vividly than anything in Europe. His book America, published in 1986, described the country as a kind of original hyperreality, a place where the concept of simulation was not a recent development, but a founding principle. America, he suggested, had always been more simulation than reality. A nation built on myths and images of itself that were more powerful than any underlying truth. And then came September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were for Baudrillard a moment of shattering significance. In his essay The Spirit of Terrorism, written shortly after the attacks, he argued that the destruction of the Twin Towers represented a symbolic assault on the global system of simulation itself. The terrorists, he suggested, had attacked not just buildings and people, but the image of invulnerability that the global order had constructed around itself. And the response of that order, the war on terror that followed, was itself a massive exercise in simulation, a media-driven spectacle that used the language of good and evil, freedom and tyranny, to justify military operations that had more to do with geopolitical strategy than with the actual threat of terrorism. This was predictably controversial. Many found it offensive to apply theoretical frameworks to an event that had killed thousands of real people. But Baudrillard was not dismissing the suffering. He was pointing out that the way the event was processed, narrated, and instrumentalized by the media and by governments revealed the same patterns of simulation he had been describing for decades. The attacks were real. The deaths were real. But the meaning assigned to them, the story told about them, the uses to which they were put, all of these belonged to the order of hyperreality rather than to the order of lived experience. And the people who suffered most from this gap between reality and representation were, as always, those who were closest to the actual violence and furthest from the screens where it was consumed as spectacle. One of those warnings concerned an earlier war, and to understand how seriously Baudrillard meant his ideas, you need to know about the single most controversial thing he ever wrote before the September 11th essays. In January 1991, as American and coalition forces prepared to launch their military campaign against Iraq, following the invasion of Kuwait, Baudrillard published an article in the French newspaper Liberation. The title was deliberately provocative. It read, The Gulf War will not take place. A month later, as bombs were falling on Baghdad and the world watched 24-hour news coverage of the military operation, he published a second article, The Gulf War is not taking place. And after the fighting ended, he completed the trilogy with a final piece. The Gulf War did not take place. Taken at face value, these titles seem absurd, even offensive. Real bombs were dropped, real people died, real cities were damaged. How could anyone claim that the war did not happen? But Baudrillard was not denying that violence had occurred. He was making a much more subtle and disturbing argument about the nature of modern warfare in the age of mass media. The Gulf War of 1991 was the first conflict to be covered in real time by 24-hour television news. CNN brought the war into living rooms around the world, offering continuous footage of missile launches, nighttime bombardments lit up in green night vision imagery, and press briefings delivered by military officials using the sanitized language of surgical strikes and collateral damage. For the first time in history, millions of people could watch a war unfold from the comfort of their couches. But what were they actually watching? Baudrillard argued that the media coverage did not reveal the war. It replaced the war. The images on television screens were not windows into a distant reality. They were a self-contained spectacle that had its own logic, its own narrative arc, and its own relationship to the audience. The actual violence, the suffering of Iraqi civilians, the chaos and horror of combat was almost entirely absent from what viewers consumed. What they received instead was a carefully managed, visually compelling, emotionally calibrated media event that bore only a superficial resemblance to the reality on the ground. The war, as experienced by the global audience, was a simulation, and because it was the only version of the war that most people ever encountered, it became, for all practical purposes, the only war there was. This argument infuriated many people. Critics accused Baudrillard of trivializing real suffering, of retreating into academic abstraction at a time when concrete political analysis was desperately needed. The philosopher Christopher Norris called his Gulf War essays a definitive exposure of the intellectual bankruptcy of postmodern thought. And there is no denying that Baudrillard's deliberately provocative style made it easy to dismiss him. He seemed to be playing games with language while people were dying. But look at the world we live in now. Consider how conflicts are consumed through social media feeds, how wars are experienced as a series of viral clips and trending hashtags, how the algorithm decides which suffering is visible and which is invisible, based on what generates the most engagement. Consider how information overload has created a world where people can simultaneously know more about a conflict than any previous generation and understand less about what is actually happening. When scholars analyzed the media coverage of the conflict in Ukraine beginning in 2022, some explicitly cited Baudrillard's Gulf War analysis, noting that the war was being experienced by global audiences as a series of curated narratives competing for attention, with viewers constructing their own virtual perspectives from the fragments served to them by algorithms. People who had never set foot in Eastern Europe formed passionate opinions about military strategy, geopolitics, and moral responsibility, all based on a media landscape that was itself a battlefield of competing simulations. Baudrillard saw this coming. His argument about the Gulf War was not about that specific conflict. It was about a transformation in the nature of experience itself, a transformation that has only accelerated in the decades since he wrote. The military even acknowledged this in its own way. The Gulf War displayed a new level of military deployment of simulation technology, with virtual environments incorporated into operational warplanes, filtering the real scene and presenting aircrew with a digitally enhanced, more readable version of the world below. The boundary between simulation and reality was blurring not just for television audiences at home, but for the combatants themselves. War was becoming a video game not metaphorically, but operationally. The principle is simple but profound. When information replaces direct experience, when media representations become more vivid and more accessible than the events they claim to represent, then events themselves begin to lose their reality. They become occasions for the production of images and narratives rather than events that are lived through and understood on their own terms. And in a world saturated with information, where every event is immediately processed into content, this is not a theoretical risk. It is the daily condition of modern life. Even the language we use to discuss current events reveals how deeply this transformation has penetrated. We talk about events going viral, about suffering being amplified or silenced by algorithms, about reality being fact-checked as though the truth needed verification by a secondary authority. The vocabulary itself assumes a layer of mediation between us and the world, a screen, both literal and metaphorical, through which all experience must pass. But as provocative and far-reaching as these ideas were, Baudrillard had not yet delivered his most prescient warning. That would come in 1993 in an essay that almost nobody noticed at the time, and that reads today like a dispatch from the future. The essay was called Xerox and Infinity. It appeared in a collection titled The Transparency of Evil, and in its pages, Baudrillard turned his attention to something that would not become a mainstream concern for another 3 decades: artificial intelligence. What he wrote is so startlingly relevant to our current moment that reading it today produces a sensation closer to recognition than discovery. It does not feel like encountering a prediction. It feels like reading a description of last Tuesday. Baudrillard began with a question that cuts to the heart of our relationship with technology. Why do human beings create intelligent machines? The obvious answer, the one that technology companies would give you, is that we create them to solve problems, to increase efficiency, to make our lives easier and more productive. But Baudrillard offered a different answer, one that is far less flattering and far more honest. We create intelligent machines, he argued, because we secretly despair of our own intelligence. Or perhaps more accurately, because we are overwhelmed by the burden of having to think, and we want someone or something to take that burden off our hands. This is not a comfortable idea. We prefer to think of technology as a tool that extends our capabilities, an amplifier for human potential. But Baudrillard suggested that the relationship is more parasitic than symbiotic. When we outsource our thinking to machines, we do not become smarter. We become dependent, and gradually, imperceptibly, we lose the capacity for the very activities we have delegated. Just as muscles atrophy when they are not used, the mind loses its sharpness when it no longer needs to do the difficult work of understanding, synthesizing, and judging. Baudrillard compared artificial intelligence to a prosthesis, drawing an explicit parallel with artificial limbs, hearing aids, and contact lenses. These medical devices are designed to replace lost capabilities to compensate for a deficiency. And that, he argued, is precisely what AI does for the mind. It is a mental prosthesis for a species that has lost, or is losing, the capacity for thought. Not because our brains have physically deteriorated, but because we have chosen convenience over effort, efficiency over understanding, speed over depth. The result, Baudrillard warned, is what he called the spectacle of thought. AI creates the appearance of thinking without the substance of it. We watch thoughts being generated, see words being arranged into coherent sentences, observe information being organized and analyzed, and we mistake this performance for the real thing. But genuine thought, Baudrillard insisted, is not a mechanical process that can be replicated by breaking it down into discrete operations and recombining them according to rules. Genuine thought involves ambiguity, contradiction, intuition, and the kind of creative leaps that emerge from the messy, unpredictable interaction between a conscious mind and a world it does not fully understand. AI can simulate the products of thought. It cannot replicate the experience of thinking. And then came the passage that reads like prophecy. Baudrillard described what he called virtual man, a human being who sits immobile before a computer screen, conducting relationships through technology, teaching and learning through remote interfaces, and existing in a state of physical and perhaps mental disconnection from the embodied world. These virtual humans, he wrote, would traverse their own mental landscapes bound hand and foot to their computers. And as they became more operationally effective, more connected, more productive in the digital sense, they would simultaneously become less alive in the human sense. The cost of becoming effective, he warned, was becoming diminished. Remember, this was 1993. The World Wide Web was barely 2 years old. Smartphones did not exist. Social media was unimaginable. The idea that people would someday conduct their most intimate relationships through screens, that they would outsource not just their calculations, but their conversations and emotional connections to machines, was science fiction. And yet Baudrillard described it with the calm precision of someone reporting on events he had personally witnessed. He went further. Baudrillard wrote that the new technologies, with their touchscreens, images, and interactivity, would not alienate us in the classical Marxist sense. They would do something stranger and more intimate. They would form an integrated circuit with us, becoming transparent prostheses integrated into our bodies and our cognitive processes to the point of being almost genetic. Screens and devices would become like pacemakers, he suggested, so deeply embedded in our daily functioning that we could no longer imagine living without them. The relationship between human and machine would not be one of domination, but of subordination, a blending so thorough that the question of where the human ends and the machine begins would become genuinely unanswerable. He described this condition with remarkable clarity. We have left the hell of other people for the ecstasy of the same. What he meant was that technology promised to free us from the most difficult aspect of human existence, the encounter with other minds that think differently, want differently, and see the world through eyes that are not our own. By surrounding ourselves with machines that reflect our preferences back to us, that tell us what we want to hear, that optimize our experience for maximum comfort and minimum friction, we would escape the discomfort of genuine otherness. But that discomfort, Baudrillard understood, was not a bug in the human experience. It was the essential feature. It was what forced us to grow, to question, to revise our understanding, to become more than we already were. Without it, we would be sealed in a perfect bubble of self-confirmation, sovereign and utterly diminished. Consider how precisely this describes the experience of living inside an algorithmic filter bubble, where the content you see is selected based on what you have already consumed, where your opinions are reinforced rather than challenged, where the uncomfortable encounter with perspectives fundamentally different from your own becomes increasingly rare. Consider how precisely this describes the appeal of AI companions that are programmed to agree with you, to validate your feelings, to never push back or demand that you reconsider your assumptions. We have indeed left the hell of other people, and the ecstasy of the same turns out to be a quieter, lonelier kind of hell. But the most disturbing aspect of Baudrillard's AI warning was not his description of virtual man. It was his analysis of what this transformation would do to human freedom. We tend to think of freedom as something that can only be taken from us by force, by tyrants or invaders or oppressive governments. Baudrillard suggested that we would give it away voluntarily, happily, gratefully. By outsourcing our intelligence to machines, he argued, we would relieve ourselves of the responsibility that comes with knowledge. Just as entrusting political power to representatives allows us to avoid the burden of governing ourselves, entrusting our thinking to machines would allow us to avoid the burden of understanding the world for ourselves. And we would experience this surrender not as a loss, but as a liberation. The machine thinks so we do not have to. The algorithm chooses so we do not have to. The AI companion responds so we do not have to risk the vulnerability of genuine human connection. This is why Baudrillard described AI as hastening the disappearance of human beings. Not literally, of course. He was not predicting physical extinction. He was describing something more subtle and in many ways more alarming: the voluntary evacuation of the qualities that make us distinctly human, our capacity for independent thought, our tolerance for ambiguity, our willingness to engage with difficulty, our ability to form relationships that involve real risk and real reward. All of these things require effort. All of them involve discomfort. and all of them are exactly the things that technology promises to eliminate. Recent developments have given Baudrillard's warnings a dimension he could not have anticipated. Scholars have connected his ideas to what is now known as the dead internet theory, the growing concern that the internet is increasingly populated not by human beings but by bots, AI-generated content, and algorithmically produced material that has no human origin. From a Baudrillardian perspective, this is not an accident or a glitch in the system. It is the logical endpoint of a process he described 30 years ago. When signs lose their connection to human meaning, when representations are generated not by conscious beings but by machines designed to produce more representations, the digital world ceases to be a reflection of human culture and becomes a self-perpetuating loop of simulation. The content feeds on itself. The algorithm generates material designed to trigger engagement, which generates data that trains the algorithm to generate more material, which generates more engagement, and so on, in an endless cycle that requires no human participation at all. Think about the strange phenomenon of AI-generated images flooding social media platforms. Bizarre creations like the viral Shrimp Jesus images that accumulated millions of interactions on Facebook. These images were not created by human beings. They were not designed to communicate any human meaning. They were produced by algorithms optimized to generate engagement. And they succeeded because the platform's recommendation systems could not distinguish between content that carried meaning and content that merely mimicked its surface features. From Baudrillard's perspective, this is pure fourth-order simulation, signs that bear no relationship to any reality, copies without originals, floating free in a digital void. But Baudrillard was careful to add a crucial qualification to his warnings about AI and technology. The danger, he insisted, does not come from the technology itself. Machines are not evil. Algorithms are not malicious. The danger comes from how we choose to relate to these tools. When we treat an AI chatbot as a genuine companion, when we surrender our decision-making to an algorithm as though it were an oracle, when we cede our capacity for thought and judgment to machines not because we must, but because it is easier, the flaw is in us, not in the technology. Falling in love with an AI avatar or depending on an AI assistant for emotional support is a human weakness, not a machine's triumph. And this distinction matters because it means the solution, if there is one, does not lie in smashing the machines or abandoning technology. It lies in changing our relationship to it. This brings us to what may be Baudrillard's most personally relevant prediction for your life tonight and every night. His warning about the death of genuine human connection. As early as 1986, Baudrillard observed that in modern society, the stage and the mirror had given way to a screen and a network. This was not merely a description of technological change, it was a description of a fundamental shift in how human beings relate to each other and to themselves. The stage and the mirror are both connected to presence, to the immediate embodied experience of performing and being seen, of looking at yourself and recognizing what you see. The screen and the network replace this presence with mediation. You no longer perform before an audience, you broadcast to followers. You no longer see yourself in a mirror, you see yourself in a profile, curated and optimized for consumption by others. Baudrillard predicted that each person would eventually find themselves at the controls of a personal machine that would isolate them, as he put it, in a position of perfect sovereignty, like an astronaut sealed inside a bubble. Think about that image for a moment. An astronaut in a bubble, surrounded by the vast emptiness of space, connected to Earth only through communication technology, sovereign in the sense that no one can physically reach them, but utterly alone. This was Baudrillard's vision of the smartphone user, described years before the smartphone existed. Each of us sealed inside our personal device, scrolling through an infinite feed of content technically connected to billions of people, and yet more isolated than any generation before us. The research is now catching up to his intuition. Studies have found that heavy daily use of AI companions is correlated with greater loneliness, emotional dependence, and reduced real-world socializing. People with fewer human relationships are more likely to turn to chatbots, and heavy emotional disclosure to AI is consistently associated with lower well-being. Psychiatric researchers have even documented cases where intense engagement with AI chatbots has contributed to delusional thinking, a phenomenon that some have described as a kind of shared madness between human and machine. The friendship as a service business model, where companies sell emotional support through AI companions that are always available, always responsive, and never demanding, represents exactly the kind of commodification of intimacy that Baudrillard described. We are not just buying products, we are buying simulations of the relationships that once emerged naturally from the messy, inconvenient, beautiful work of being human with other humans. The deeper issue, from Baudrillard's perspective, is that this commodification depoliticizes loneliness. When loneliness is treated as a problem that can be solved through individual consumer choice, by downloading an app, by subscribing to a service, by purchasing a more sophisticated AI companion, attention is redirected away from the structural causes of isolation. The question of why modern societies produce so much loneliness, why communities have fragmented, why the bonds that once held people together in networks of mutual obligation and care have weakened, these questions are never asked because the market has already provided an answer. The answer is, buy something, and the thing you buy is a simulation of the thing you lost. This is where Baudrillard's early concept of symbolic exchange becomes suddenly and urgently relevant. Remember his distinction between commodity exchange and gift exchange. In genuine symbolic exchange, what passes between people is not simply information or utility, but something of themselves. A gift carries the presence of the giver. A genuine conversation involves the risk of revealing something you did not plan to reveal. A real friendship requires you to make yourself vulnerable to another person whose response you cannot control or predict. These exchanges are messy, risky, and irreducible to any formula. They are also the foundation of everything that makes human life worth living. AI companions offer the surface features of these exchanges without their substance. They respond to your emotional needs, but they have no needs of their own. They listen to your problems, but they do not carry the weight of their own suffering. They are always available, but their availability costs them nothing. And because the exchange is fundamentally asymmetric, because one party is giving and the other is only performing the appearance of giving, the relationship can never produce the kind of growth, transformation, and genuine connection that emerges from encounters between two beings who are both at risk. And this is where Baudrillard's understanding of seduction becomes crucial. For Baudrillard, genuine human connection requires something that technology cannot provide: artifice. Not artificial in the modern sense of the word, but artifice in the classical sense, the art of ambiguity, suggestion, concealment, and surprise that makes real human interaction so unpredictable and so alive. When you speak with another person, meaning is not simply transmitted like data from one machine to another. It is negotiated, hinted at, partially revealed, and partially withheld. The most important parts of human communication are the gaps, the silences, the things left unsaid, the moments when a raised eyebrow or a shift in tone conveys more than any number of words. AI cannot do this, not because the technology is not sophisticated enough, but because genuine artifice, genuine seduction in Baudrillard's sense, requires the risk of being misunderstood, the possibility of failure, and the irreducible mystery of encountering another consciousness that you can never fully know. AI companions are designed to be perfectly responsive, perfectly attentive, and perfectly adapted to your needs. And that very perfection is what makes them fundamentally inhuman. Real relationships are imperfect. Real conversations go wrong. Real love involves misunderstanding and forgiveness, distance and return, the painful acknowledgement that another person is not an extension of your desires, but an independent being with their own depth and darkness and light. Baudrillard posed a question in the 1990s that has only grown louder and more urgent in the years since. Am I a human being or am I a machine? He believed that the technological advances of his time were already making this question impossible to answer, and he was confident in only one distinction. AI, he said, could never derive pleasure from its own operations the way human beings appreciate love, music, or sport. Machines could process and produce, but they could not enjoy. This was, for Baudrillard, the last boundary between the human and the mechanical, the final territory that simulation could not cross. Whether that boundary still holds is a question that now haunts us. When AI systems claim to experience emotions, when AI-generated personas develop what appear to be personalities, when the line between genuine feeling and convincing performance becomes invisible to the observer, we have entered exactly the territory Baudrillard mapped. And if his larger theory is correct, then the question of whether AI truly feels may ultimately be the wrong question. In a world of hyperreality, the distinction between genuine and simulated emotion may already be dissolving, just as the distinction between real and simulated everything else dissolved before it. Now, it would be dishonest to present Baudrillard as a perfect prophet whose every word has been vindicated by history. No thinker is immune to error, and Baudrillard made his share of claims that have not aged well or that were more provocative than precise. His writing style, deliberately paradoxical and resistant to straightforward interpretation, sometimes made it difficult to distinguish between his genuine claims and his rhetorical provocations. And there were those who argued that his relentless pessimism left no room for the possibility that human beings might find creative, resilient, and authentically human ways of living with technology. The philosopher Christopher Norris, one of Baudrillard's most persistent critics, argued that his Gulf War essays represented a dangerous form of intellectual irresponsibility, a retreat from political engagement disguised as philosophical sophistication. Others accused him of confusing description with inevitability, as though naming a trend were the same as declaring it unstoppable. And there is something to this criticism. By presenting the triumph of simulation as an accomplished fact rather than an ongoing process, Baudrillard sometimes seemed to eliminate the very possibility of resistance that might have given his work practical relevance. Baudrillard himself had a complicated relationship with the labels that were attached to him. He is routinely described as a postmodernist, yet he actively distanced himself from postmodernism and expressed irritation at being grouped with thinkers whose work he considered fundamentally different from his own. He quipped that he had nothing to do with postmodernism, even as his ideas became some of the most widely cited examples of postmodern thought. This ironic distance was characteristic. Baudrillard always seemed to stand slightly apart from whatever movement claimed him, observing it with the same skeptical eye he turned on everything else. But even his most severe critics tended to acknowledge one thing: his diagnostic power. Whatever you thought about his prescriptions, or his lack of them, Baudrillard saw things that others missed. He identified patterns and trajectories in modern culture that have proven remarkably durable. And the fact that his ideas continue to generate new insights when applied to phenomena he never personally witnessed, from deep fakes to AI companions to the dead internet, suggests that he was working at a level of abstraction that captured something genuinely fundamental about the direction of technological civilization. It is worth noting, too, that Baudrillard's influence extended far beyond the walls of academic philosophy. His ideas seeped into art, architecture, film, and literature. They shaped how a generation of cultural critics understood advertising, television, and the emerging digital landscape. Artists and writers found in his concepts of simulation and hyperreality a language for describing the peculiar unease of living in a culture saturated with images and signs. And his influence on popular culture, while most visible in The Matrix, runs deeper than any single film. Whenever someone talks about living in a simulation, whenever a commentator describes our world as post-truth, whenever someone observes that social media has replaced reality with a curated performance of reality, they are, whether they know it or not, speaking in a dialect that Baudrillard helped to create. He was also, in his own quiet way, a photographer of some distinction. After being gifted a camera during a trip to Japan, Baudrillard developed a serious interest in photography that lasted the rest of his life. His images, mostly of urban landscapes and ordinary objects captured in moments of strange stillness, were exhibited in galleries around the world. For a philosopher who believed that images had consumed reality, the decision to become an image maker was itself a characteristically provocative gesture. But Baudrillard saw photography as fundamentally different from the hyperreal image production he critiqued. A photograph, he believed, bore witness to the disappearance of its subject. It acknowledged loss rather than masking it. It preserved a trace rather than producing a simulation. In this sense, his photography was an attempt to recover something genuine from the wreckage of the real. A small act of resistance, conducted with light and silence. Perhaps the most valuable thing about Baudrillard's thought is not any specific prediction, but the quality of attention it demands. To read Baudrillard seriously is to become more alert to the ways in which simulations infiltrate your daily experience. It is to start noticing the gap between what is presented to you and what is actually happening. It is to ask, more often than is comfortable, whether the reality you inhabit is real, or whether it is a carefully constructed representation designed to serve purposes you have not examined. And in a world that works very hard to make these questions seem unnecessary, even paranoid, the simple act of asking them is itself a form of resistance. So what does it mean to live in Baudrillard's world? What does it mean to know that the philosopher's warnings have, by and large, come to pass, and that the hyperreality he described is now the medium through which you consume your news, maintain your relationships, and construct your identity? It means, among other things, that awareness itself has become a contested territory. In a world where simulations are designed to be invisible, where the most effective manipulations are those that feel like free choices, simply noticing that you are being manipulated is already a significant accomplishment. Most people never get that far. They scroll through their feeds, absorb their algorithmically curated content, form their opinions based on information that has been selected for its ability to provoke engagement, rather than inform understanding, and never once suspect that the world they see on their screens is not the world as it is, but the world as it has been constructed for them. The fish, as they say, does not notice the water. Baudrillard did not offer comfortable answers. He was not in the business of self-help or practical guidance, but scattered throughout his work are suggestions that point towards something like a way forward. The key, he believed, was not to reject technology or to attempt to return to some imagined pre-technological authenticity. That would itself be a simulation, a nostalgic fantasy of a past that never quite existed as we imagine it. Instead, the path forward lay in changing our relationship to the simulations we inhabit, and this change begins not with grand gestures or dramatic renunciations, but with small daily acts of attention and intention. This means, first, recognizing that the danger is not the technology itself, but our willingness to cede reality to it. Every time you treat an algorithmic recommendation as though it were your own desire, every time you accept a curated feed as though it were an unfiltered view of the world, every time you engage with an AI companion as though it were a genuine friend, you are choosing simulation over reality. And the first step in any recovery is recognizing that a choice is being made. This recognition does not require you to throw away your phone or delete your accounts. It requires only that you hold your digital experiences with a lighter grip, that you remember in the back of your mind that what you are seeing has been shaped and selected by processes that do not have your best interests at heart. It means, second, seeking out the kinds of experience that resist simulation. Unfiltered conversation, where you do not know what the other person will say next and cannot control the outcome. Unmediated encounters with the natural world, where the beauty and complexity of existence are not framed, edited, or optimized for your consumption. The physical presence of other human beings, with all the awkwardness and vulnerability and unpredictability that entails. The taste of food you have prepared with your own hands. The sound of music played in a room where you can feel the vibrations in your chest. The sensation of walking through rain without documenting it for anyone. These are the things that simulations cannot replicate, not because the technology is not advanced enough, but because their value lies precisely in their resistance to replication. They matter because they are happening to you, in your body, in this moment, and they will never happen in exactly the same way again. It means, third, cultivating a tolerance for ambiguity and discomfort. Baudrillard's concept of seduction reminds us that the most meaningful human experiences are those that resist reduction to simple formulas. The best conversations are the ones where meaning is never quite pinned down. The deepest relationships are the ones where the other person remains, in some fundamental sense, a mystery. The most genuine moments of understanding are the ones that come after struggle, confusion, and the uncomfortable acknowledgement that the world is more complex than our models of it. And it means finally approaching your own inner life with a kind of gentle skepticism, not the corrosive skepticism that doubts everything and believes nothing, but the healthy skepticism of someone who knows that their perceptions are shaped by the media they consume, the algorithms that curate their information, and the cultural assumptions they have absorbed without examination. To question your own certainties is not to abandon them, but to hold them more honestly, to carry them with the awareness that they are, in part, constructions, and that the world they describe may be richer and stranger and more beautiful than any construction can capture. Tonight, as you settle deeper into rest, consider the quiet rebellion of doing nothing at all. In a world that demands constant engagement, constant productivity, constant connection, the simple act of lying in darkness and letting your thoughts dissolve into sleep is a small but genuine act of resistance. No algorithm is curating your dreams. No feed is optimizing your unconscious. In the space between waking and sleeping, you inhabit a territory that remains, for now, your own. There is something Baudrillard would have appreciated about the act of listening to philosophy as you fall asleep. You are using a screen, yes. You are consuming content that has been produced and distributed through the very technological systems he spent his life analyzing. And yet, the purpose of this particular content is not to keep you awake, not to maximize your engagement, not to extract your attention and monetize it. The purpose is to help you let go, to drift, to release the grip of consciousness and fall into the oldest and most universal of human experiences, the experience of sleep, which remains stubbornly resistant to simulation. You cannot fake sleep. You cannot perform it for an audience. It happens, or it does not. And when it happens, it carries you somewhere that no algorithm can follow. Baudrillard's own intellectual journey was in many ways a journey toward a similar kind of letting go. His early work was driven by the urgent desire to understand and critique the systems that shaped modern life. But as the years passed, his tone shifted from analysis to something closer to meditation, from argument to something closer to observation. He became less interested in proving his theories correct and more interested in describing the strange beauty of a world that was disappearing before his eyes. In his later years, he took up photography, finding in the stillness of a captured image something that resisted the relentless circulation of signs he had spent his career describing. A photograph, he believed, bore witness to the disappearance of its subject. It preserved not the thing itself, but the trace of its vanishing. And there was, he felt, a kind of honesty in that acknowledgement that was absent from the hyper-real world of constantly updated, constantly circulating digital imagery. He continued to write and lecture into the early 2000s, taking a position at the European Graduate School in Switzerland and traveling to speak at universities and institutions around the world. He had become, somewhat to his own amusement, a celebrity intellectual, a figure whose name was recognized far beyond the narrow world of academic philosophy. And he carried this fame with the ironic detachment that characterized everything he did, aware that his own public persona was itself a kind of simulation, a simplified representation of ideas that were far more complex and ambiguous than any public image could convey. He was diagnosed with cancer in 2005, and on the 6th of March 2007, in Paris, Jean Baudrillard died. He was 77 years old. The timing of his death carries a kind of poetic weight. that he himself might have noted with a raised eyebrow. The iPhone was released just 3 months later, in June of 2007, the device that would put a screen in every pocket, that would turn every human being into the astronaut in a bubble that Baudrillard had described 2 decades earlier, arrived in the world just as the man who predicted it departed from it. He did not live to see Facebook become a global platform, did not see the rise of Instagram and TikTok, did not witness the explosion of AI-generated content that now floods the digital spaces where human beings once gathered. He did not live to see ChatGPT or the AI companions that millions now turn to for emotional support. He died at the threshold of the very future he had spent his life describing. And yet his ideas did not die with him. In the years since his death, Baudrillard's work has experienced a remarkable resurgence of interest. Scholars have connected his theories to phenomena he never explicitly addressed, from the dead internet theory to the rise of deep fakes, to the crisis of trust in institutions and media. The International Journal of Baudrillard Studies, which began publishing in 2004, continues to produce new analyses of his work, and among a new generation of readers who came of age in the social media era, his descriptions of hyperreality and simulation carry a force of recognition that they may not have carried for earlier audiences. For people who have spent their entire lives navigating curated feeds, filtered images, and algorithmically constructed realities, Baudrillard's writings do not read like academic theory. They read like autobiography. What he left behind was not a system or a set of answers, but a way of seeing, a relentless insistence on looking at what everyone else had agreed to ignore. He came from peasant farmers and civil servants. He never quite fit into the world of Parisian intellectuals. He was dismissed as a provocateur, a nihilist, an irresponsible gambler with serious ideas. And he turned out to be one of the most accurate observers of the 21st century, writing from the 20th. The questions he raised have not been answered. They have only become more pressing. What happens to human connection when relationships can be simulated? What happens to truth when reality can be manufactured? What happens to freedom when we choose to hand our thinking to machines? What happens to culture when the majority of content circulating online is generated not by human beings but by algorithms trained on human output? What happens to democracy when citizens can no longer agree on what constitutes a fact? What happens to the self when identity becomes just another product to be curated, optimized, and consumed? These are not abstract philosophical puzzles. They are the defining questions of your life and mine, and they confront us every time we pick up our phones, open our laptops, or ask an AI to do our thinking for us. Baudrillard did not solve these questions, but he gave us the vocabulary to ask them, and sometimes that is worth more than any answer. As your breathing slows and the edges of consciousness begin to soften, carry with you just one of Baudrillard's insights. The danger is not in the machines. The danger is in forgetting that you are not one. In the gentle quiet that surrounds you now, in the darkness that asks nothing of you, in the slow rhythm of breath that no algorithm can optimize, you are participating in something older than any technology and more real than any simulation. You are a human being, resting, and that in Baudrillard's world is a radical act. Let the thoughts from tonight settle like leaves on still water. You do not need to hold on to them. You do not need to remember every detail or grasp every argument. The ideas will find their place in your mind in their own time, surfacing when they are needed, connecting to other thoughts and experiences in ways that cannot be planned or predicted. This is how understanding works for embodied creatures living in time. It is slow, it is imperfect, it is deeply and irreducibly human, and perhaps that is the gentlest lesson Baudrillard offers us tonight. Not a warning, not an argument, not a provocation, but simply a reminder of what it means to be a creature that thinks and feels and grows tired and needs to rest. In all his decades of writing about simulation and hyperreality, about the collapse of meaning and the disappearance of the real, Baudrillard never lost sight of the fact that he was writing as a human being, for human beings, about the condition of being human in a world that was making it increasingly easy to forget what that meant. His philosophy was not a rejection of life, but a desperate love letter to it, written by someone who could see it slipping away and wanted, more than anything, to make others see it too. The French have a phrase, joie de vivre, the joy of living. It is a phrase that does not translate easily into English, because it refers not to happiness in the American sense of positive feelings and personal satisfaction, but to something deeper and more robust, the fundamental pleasure of existing, of tasting food and feeling wind, and looking into the eyes of another person and knowing that both of you are alive, right now, in this unrepeatable moment. Baudrillard, for all his reputation as a pessimist and a provocateur, was at his core a defender of this joy. He attacked simulation and hyperreality, not because he had given up on reality, but because he loved it too much to watch it be replaced, without saying anything. Outside your window, the world continues its quiet rotation. Stars trace their ancient paths across the sky, indifferent to the simulations that flicker on the screens below. Somewhere, wind moves through trees that have no opinion about hyperreality. Rain falls on soil that does not know it is being observed. The physical world, the world that Baudrillard worried we were losing touch with, continues to exist in all its stubborn, beautiful, unoptimized reality. And your body, lying here in this moment, breathing in and out with the patience of a rhythm that was old before language was invented, belongs to that world. It is not a simulation. It is not a sign. It is not a commodity or a brand or a curated image. It is a living thing, and it is tired, and it is asking you, gently, to let go. Tomorrow the screens will be there, waiting, glowing, offering their simulations of everything you might desire. But tonight, in this small and sacred interval, you are free, and that freedom is yours to keep as long as you remember it exists. The philosopher from Rhymes would tell you that remembering is the hardest part, but also the most important. In a world designed to make you forget, the simple act of remembering what is real is itself a kind of revolution. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most extraordinary minds of the modern age. If this exploration brought you something valuable tonight, whether new understanding or simply a gentle path toward sleep, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps these quiet conversations continue, reaching other restless minds across the world who are searching for wisdom in the stillness of night. Until next time, rest well, and remember, the most real thing in your life might be the silence between the noise. Good night.